Well, welcome everyone to the Future Work Scotland. Fantastic to have you here. Warm welcome to you. If this is your first time, very warm welcome to you. If you've been here before, welcome back. I'm your host for the session, Sathpal Singh, and my co-pilot this evening is Paula. Give everybody a wave, Paula, so we can see you. So my usual co-pilot, Donald, he's not available this evening, which is rare for him. So Paula's kindly stepped in to help me out because I can't really do this on my own. So we just remind everyone just to mute, just while we're kicking off. That would be greatly appreciated. So just the usual formalities, simple code of conduct. Just be respectful to each other. Want everyone to have an excellent time, and we'll do some announcements and things as we often do at the end. What else was I going to say? And yeah, questions. So Q&A. As Peter goes through his content, please drop your questions if you have any into the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end of Peter's session and play them back. But if you could prefix them with a Q, that way we can spot them when we sift through all the comments, etc. So that would be brilliant. Portia, could you do me a favour to just mute, please? That would be helpful because you're kind of appearing up my screen. So okay, great. And yeah, I think without further ado, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Peter Stevens to Future Work Scotland this evening. I've known Peter for a few years now. Our paths first crossed in Agile 20 Reflect Festival, as many of you will remember. Peter almost needs an introduction. He's really seasoned, experienced practitioner. He's a coach. He's multiple things, really. He's a serial co-founder, I would say, as well. And amongst other things, he was one of the co-founders of the World Agility Forum, amongst other things. And he's also the co-founder of the Personal Agility System, which is really what brings us here this evening. And he's also written this. I've got an ebook copy, so I'm just going to get that up there now if you haven't seen it before. So that's his new book that he's co-authored with Maria Martorelli, who we also know. And it's an excellent read. There's really great nuggets in there. So I would definitely encourage you to pick up a copy and divulge the amazing insights within. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Peter as he can introduce and help us better understand how we can take advantage of the personal agility system. Peter, the floor is yours, sir.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation, and I'm delighted to see so many people here, and especially some names and faces who I've been seeing kind of over the years. Let me get my screen share going. Now, I put a link in the chat to a Mentimeter. We just kind of do a quick assessment of how we're doing at work. Okay. Well, the first one is where we're from. That's the most interesting question, and then some things about our effectiveness, both from the internal perspective and the external perspective, and also, of course, the key question: how many meetings? And so, what we'll do is we'll let that run for about probably till I get to the end of the first unit, and then we'll come back and take a look at the results. So let's see if the screen share will cooperate. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Wow. Marvels of technology, wonders never cease. Okay, I looked at this title, Reinventing Agility, and I thought, oh my God, did I really say Reinventing Agility? Because it feels to me like the Agile movement is kind of going through a crisis right now, or an identity crisis right now. And so I'd like to kind of take a look at that, and then kind of look at what I think is some of the kind of what's driving some of our issues, and probably things that we haven't talked much about in the Agile space. I'd like to start out with a story. One of the puzzles that I have is, agility is all about managing complexity. And there are a few things in this world that you can do that are more complex than running a company. So, how can it be that agility is designed to manage complexity, but the people who are managing complex organizations, in many cases, agility just doesn't seem to resonate with them? Now, Walter was actually, it was funny. His wife and my wife sing in the same choir, which is, I think, how he found out about me and what we were doing. And Walter is the executive director, or I guess the former executive director now, of a creative consultancy based in Zurich. And he was having a problem, and that problem was starting to cut close to the bone. He had a talent problem. His staff kind of didn't know why they were there, and because his staff didn't know why they were there, his customers or their customers didn't know why they should come to them either, and that was having consequences both in terms of employee fluctuation, but also in terms of revenue. Okay, now Walter recognized that there was a problem. He set out to change it. And 2 years later, this is where he was. He knew he wanted to change. He tried to change, but they were literally unable to do so. Now, when I got involved with this, and as I say, this was a personal contact, Walter knew he had two problems. Okay, the first problem was the one about profitability. You see that in the balance sheet. He knew he had a problem with talent because he saw the fluctuation in the staff, and people were coming, but they weren't staying. What we discovered, or when I got involved, is he also had a multitasking problem. Okay, and the multitasking problem was preventing him from fixing the other two, or addressing the other two challenges. Okay, so basically, when I first got involved, they'd been in existence for about maybe 2.5 years. They needed to up their game. They needed to solve the talent problem. They identified a long list of measures to fix it. Walter gave them a time box of 2 years, and he kind of basically set an alarm clock for himself. If we haven't got this problem fixed in 2 years, we have serious issues. And they started all these initiatives. They dedicated 10% of the capacity of the top 10 people in the company. Now, this is a company with about 30 people. And, it's a consulting company, so, even the top people are expected to do client work. Okay, and they started their initiatives. Now, to them, it felt like they had developed a huge percentage of their work to these initiatives, but it just felt like they were crawling, like they weren't making any progress, and they get halfway into something, and then they discovered they needed to rethink it, and so anyway. 2 years later, how many of the initiatives had arrived at a successful conclusion? Okay, and the short answer was basically zero. None of them. None of the goals that they'd set out to achieve 2 years before had been achieved. And as I say, this is where I got involved. And I explained to him, or we talked about the multitasking problem and how multitasking was just killing their performance. And if he wanted to fix the multitasking problem, he needed something that looked like agility. Okay, and so we talked about the 5 elements. So I'll talk about these in details later, but you'll see that these map pretty well onto things you see in Scrum and Kanban, and most explicitly in personal agility. And these things were the key to solving his problem. Okay, so on the second attempt, how did that look? Well, the point of departure was the same, except that Walter himself committed to be part of the solution. Okay, and that was very important. And they also decided to work in cadence. Okay, in Scrum, you would call it sprints. I think Kanban uses the term cadence. Some people use the term iterations. The idea is that they would set a small number of goals that they could achieve in approximately 3 weeks. Okay, now their cadence wasn't as rigid as a Scrum team. Okay, they didn't do it every third Thursday because, well, they had customers and customer work had priority. But, roughly every 3 weeks, that's when they had their goals. They set their goals, and then they would do, they would see, have we achieved our goals? What have we learned? What do we need to do next? Okay, so working on a small number of things in iterations, set a goal, achieve the goal or not, and then do your best to achieve it the next time around, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. After 6 months, they had literally achieved all of their goals. Okay, they got the talent problem solved. When the talent problem got solved, the financial problem got solved, and of course the multitasking problem had gone away. And what that meant is that they had basically been able to achieve all of their goals, okay, with half of the work. Now the work is the backlog items that they'd set for themselves. Okay, so turns out a lot of the things that they thought that they needed to do, they either didn't need to do them or they were taken care of by something else that they were doing. So there was a lot of work that they didn't need to do. And they were able to successfully complete in 6 months what they had previously failed to achieve in 2 years. Okay, so roughly a factor of 4 improvement. Maybe you've heard of Jeff Sutherland's book, Twice the Work in Half the Time. That's been known to offend some physicists in the room because they say that makes no sense. Okay, fine. All the goals, half the work, quarter of the time. The proportions are right, even if the how shall I say, if Jeff's title was designed to sell books rather than train people. So where does that leave us? Well, Walter, at the end of the story, was quite a happy man. Okay, as I say, he'd achieved all of the goals. And for him, this was about transferring the company to the next generation. And he was able to do that. And in fact, I believe since the 1st of January, he's no longer executive director. He's been able to successfully pass on the company to the next generation. Okay, so all in all, this was a very good result. He is one of the featured cases in my book on personal agility, which came out about 6 months ago. I think it was officially available for sale on Amazon in November. But a lot of other things have happened this year. In particular, there's been a big retrenchment in the whole IT branch. Okay, and we go through and all of the big names, 10%, 20%. Some of them have done multiple iterations of laying people off. For me, most of those cases is just, well, okay, capitalism is going to be capitalism. Maybe we need to renegotiate. Maybe we've gotten too excited about hiring too many people. The salary levels are totally outrageous. Let's calm down a bit. So these 5 to 10% layoffs, that's kind of a normal thing. But there were a couple that I thought were particularly interesting because they had potential lessons for us. Okay, so it was Capital One, there was Twitter, and there was Shopify. So let's take a look at these one at a time. Capital One basically laid off everyone with Agile in their job title. It's about 1,400 people. And so, any Agile this, Agile coach, Agile business analyst, Agile this, Agile that, they were all told to either find new jobs, either somewhere in the company or somewhere outside the company. And, I think that this was a big shock for the Agile community as a whole, because basically this wasn't just a failure. This was kind of this was a company that has attempted many Agile transitions. As well, it wasn't the first that they've tried, and it probably won't be the last. But somehow it felt like, is this the Empire Strikes Back or a global rejection? One thing that I've noticed is I don't think that agility, the way we talk about it today, I don't think it offers much to the leaders of most companies. Okay, agility is mostly about teams, groups of people collaborating to deliver stuff together. Okay, and most executives aren't really part of a team that delivers stuff. They may be part of a group that shares responsibility for something, and they're usually responsible for a particular function or a particular group of people. But the whole thing about collaboration and producing, it's not quite the right model. So that part doesn't resonate. Okay, and of course, what does a Scrum team tell the executives? Well, the Scrum team says, Ms. Executive, stand back, get out of the way, let us do our jobs, and if we need you, we'll call you. And that's not exactly what most executives are looking for when they went into an executive role. They want to solve problems. They want to move the needle for their organizations. So I think that this is a sign. I think it's that there's a mismatch between what the Agile community is offering to organizations. And I also think that, and whether this is a chicken or egg, whether the problem is with the organizations or with the community, I'm not quite sure. But somehow the problems we're solving aren't, I think this is a sign that it's not resonating. Now, one of the things in my own work, I've been doing a lot on, kind of copyright and how do you write things that, are attractive to your customers. Okay, and maybe some of you saw my post on LinkedIn. You make it clear who you're talking to. You make it clear what their advantage is. In my case, I've got a simple message. Give me 3 hours of your time and I'll save you 3 hours a week, by getting rid of meetings that don't bring you value. And, very simple, clear, very simple message. What is the message of the Agile community to executives? Okay, and I just don't think we have that clear that clearer message. Now, Twitter is a very interesting case, and these next two cases are in some ways, they've become rather controversial. And they're so controversial, the name Musk has become something of a lightning rod, particularly because of the way he did the Twitter takeover. But basically, Musk came in and laid off half of the organization. Okay, and everyone expected the organization to roll over and die, and rather surprisingly, it did not. Now, I think there's a reason for that, which we're going to explore. And I think there's also, well, Twitter is now at about 80% of the staffing level, sorry, 20%. They've laid off, since Musk took over, they've laid off 80%. Okay, and it's not clear to me that Twitter's going to survive. But I think there's a case study. I think there's a why he did it, and there's also an object lesson in how not to do it, which I want to take a look at. And finally, Shopify. Now, Shopify, if Musk tried to slice the Gordian knot, Shopify tried to untie it. Okay, and Shopify, not only did they, well, they laid off 10% like everyone else, but they also introduced a culture of focus and canceled a lot of meetings, and that had some very interesting effects and side effects, which I want to take a look at as well. I actually think that's validation for Musk's theory. Kind of about where's the value zone of an organization, and how much do we really need the non-value part of the organization. So having said all that, for me, agility is really about hope. Okay, it's not about it's not about story points, and it's not about sprints, and it's not about software development. Agility is fundamentally the search for a better way. Okay, if we look at that first sentence of the Agile Manifesto, let's just gloss over where it uses the word software development and replace it with something that's relevant to our context. We're uncovering better ways of doing what we do by doing it and helping others to do it. Okay, and in those words, I find learning and I find collaboration. And we go to the first principle and we find our highest priority is to satisfy the customer. Okay, so purpose, learning, collaboration, purpose, and more fundamentally, a belief that there is a better way. Okay, and I've been in the Agile community now teaching Scrum and Agility for about 15 years. And people come up to me 10 years, who I taught a Scrum course to for 2 or 3 days 10 years ago, and they say this changed my life. And everything from a guy who's now living in Mexico to a guy who completely changed his career direction. Okay, so I think that there is tremendous power in what we do. Okay, and even if there's trauma and challenges because of what's happening in the tech market these days, I don't think there's any reason to question the underlying merits of agility and what it represents for people. And so how do I fit into this? Well, I believe most companies have huge potential to improve. Okay, and in general, they come to me because they want their initiatives to move forward. They want to see value sooner. Okay, and that's what agility, as a practical matter for organizations, I think that's what it's all about. So what I'd like to talk to you about today, 3 things. First, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to personal agility. I'd like to do a deep dive on the multitasking problem. And then I'd like to look at, well, especially Twitter and to a lesser extent Spotify, try to understand the reason behind the madness, the method behind the madness. Yes, and see what lessons there are for us in terms of, how can we solve the right problems for our organizations. So, ready? Let's start with personal agility. So, personal agility started out as a way for me to get better at getting things done. And it evolved into a method for leading yourself. And much to our surprise, well, actually most of the development of personal agility really surprised us, a way to lead others. Okay, and so what I'd like to do is explore that with you first by looking at what is leadership. Now, if you follow LinkedIn, there are lots of people writing about leadership, and they put out nice graphics like this one. Okay, what people think leadership is. Telling people what to do. Yes. No. Leadership is. And we have a long list of things about leadership. Okay. And the funny thing is I don't disagree with anything that's written here. It's all true, except to me it feels not very tangible, and it doesn't say anything about what it is that a leader is trying to accomplish. Okay, and if we want to talk about personal leadership, well, how does this scale down to a single individual? Okay, now that telling you what to do, well, who gets to tell you what to do? Do you get to tell yourself what to do? It's actually kind of an interesting question, but that definitely doesn't scale down to one person. And even these other aspects, well, what does it mean? Use of influence, casting a vision. How does that relate to me as a single? Trying to organize my life and achieve my own goals. And so I prefer to think of leadership more pragmatically in terms of what it is that we're trying to accomplish as leaders. Okay, and even applying this to me. Okay, leading myself means I want to achieve my long-term goals. There are distractions, there are impediments, there are challenges, there are, the risk of losing focus, but, I still have dreams and I still have goals and I want to achieve them. The other thing it means is to be able to respond effectively to new information. Okay, now that new information could be, one of my kids comes in with a skinned knee. That new information could be the IT industry is contracting and it's going to be difficult to find consulting work. What am I going to do? Okay, these are things that we need to be able to process. Yes, we have a vision, but there's also the real world. Okay, so I think leadership, self-leadership, really boils down to these two things: achieving your goals, responding effectively to change. So how does personal agility fit into all this? Now, personal agility starts with a couple of very simple observations. The first, time is your most valuable currency. You only get to spend it once. And in fact, you have to spend it. There's no saving it. Okay? Every second that goes by, there's nothing you can do about it. But what you do have control over is how you use your time, what you do with your time. Okay? And this takes us to clarity of purpose. So I'd like to invite you to think back, over the last 7 days or so, and think about how you spent your time. Okay. Now, some of those things you did because you had to do it. Some of those things you did because somebody important to you wanted you to do them, and you did it with a smile. Some of those things you did because somebody who, well, we won't get into the details of the relationship, but maybe you did it with less of a smile. You had to do it. Okay. And some of them you did because you really wanted to do them, because they mean something for you. So I'd just like you to think about that balance, between, the different forces in your life, the things you have to do, the things you do because they're a pleasure, the things you do for yourself, and say, well, what if you could spend a bit more of your time on things that you care about? What would that be like? How would that be different than things are today? Okay. And sometimes, a lot of people, they're not spending any time on things they care about. And even just getting half an hour a week or an hour a week is, can make dramatic changes in their lives. Okay. So how do we do that? How do we spend more time on things we care about? And in personal agility, we have a metaphor, and that metaphor is navigation. Okay. So I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you are the captain of a ship, a sailing ship. Before, there were fancy things like GPS that would just turn it on and tell you where you are. And you wanted to do something like sail to a faraway place. And we'll use Jamaica as the example for our destination, which also represents your long-term goals. How do you sail from Portugal to Jamaica? You get out into the ocean and you look in any direction and all you see is water. Okay. Well, it turns out you can use, you can use the stars, you can use the sun, you can use the pole star. You need a clock in order for it to actually work, but with a clock, and you can see what time the three sisters of Orion are coming over the horizon. You can look at what time the sun rises or the sun sets. You can look at how high the pole star or the Southern Cross is in the sky, and you can figure out your latitude and your longitude. Okay, so you can figure out where you are, but you have to look, you have to measure. Okay, so how do you get across the ocean? Well, you calculate your course, and you set sail. And you say, okay, after a day, this is where I expect to be, somewhere around the Azores. Okay, so you set sail, you point the boat in the right direction. You get to the end of the day and you look at what time the stars come up and you look at where the pole star is. You figure out where you are. You say, I'm on course. The boat is pointed in the right direction. Okay, so personal agility, Jamaica, that represents the long-term goal, the thing you're trying to achieve, the person you're trying to be, or you want to be at some point in the future. Okay, now it turns out the ocean is not always a calm and tranquil place. Okay, there are storms in the ocean. Okay, and there's weather and wind and waves and clouds. And, because of that, you can't see the stars. You don't, the boat might be rocking so heavily that you're more worried about keeping the boat afloat than you are about, doing your navigation chores. And so what do? Well, you do what you have to do. You keep that boat afloat. Sooner or later, the seas calm down again. Okay, where is the boat? Well, that's kind of the first question is, where am I? And you'll notice those waves are pointing you in many different directions. And the least likely direction is Jamaica. So it's, okay, where am I? Oh, wait a minute, where's Jamaica? Oh, Jamaica's off to the right. Okay, turn the boat, that'll take about a 100-degree right turn, and resume course to Jamaica. Okay, so we talk about cadence. Okay, and so the idea is you take a fix, understand where you are, you sail for a bit. During that time, you might be busy doing other things. You're trying to point the boat in the right direction, but you might get distracted. Okay, fine. After a period of time, take a fix again, see if you're still on course. If you're off course, it's not the end of the world. Get back on course. Okay, and in fact, what we see very often, especially in this kind of metaphor, arriving is more important than the schedule. Okay, back in the day, there was no, oh yes, we're going to be here with a tolerance of plus or minus 15 minutes. And so you notice we have a rather different philosophy to achieving your goals. It's about arriving. It's not about project management and staying exactly on the track and the timetable that you expected. Okay, so we talk about purpose, navigation, and cadence. And personal agility provides you with a series of questions to ask. So personal agility is not a process to follow, but rather it's based on dialogue. Okay, and the key here is what are known as powerful questions. One of the most powerful questions is what really matters. That what really matters is both about your Jamaica, but also about your navigation stars. Okay, and this is how you can tell if you're on course or not. Okay, and then the navigation questions, well, the first one is, what did I do last week? Okay, this is understanding, this is looking at that breadcrumb trail to see where the boat is coming from. Okay, and then we have the triage questions. Well, what could I do next week? What are the possible courses I could set? And then of those things, what's urgent, what's important, what's going to make me happy? Well, wait a minute, am I allowed to do things that make me happy? Absolutely, you're allowed to do things that make you happy. Okay, so now you've got the big picture, and you say, okay, what do I want to focus on this week? Okay, and so we call that celebration. What did you get done? Choosing or choice. What do you want to do? What's the course you're going to set for the next week? And that whole process is considered navigation. Okay, and so the idea is, last week you were somebody. You got some stuff done that made you who you are today. Slightly different person than you were a week ago. Next week you're going to do some other stuff. Okay, and that other stuff should take you a step closer to being the person who you want to be, or achieving the goals that you've set for yourself. Okay, now there's the sixth question, who can help? In a personal context, that's kind of a coach's let's get unstuck question. Okay, if you're stuck, well, what would Sath do in this case? Okay, what would Wonder Woman do? Okay, you can kind of use that to look at it from a different perspective. Sometimes Sath might even be the person to call, or maybe Wonder Woman, or maybe your mom, who knows? When we look at this in an organizational context, what we're going to discover is that if the answer to that question is not close at hand, we have a dependency. And dependency is a gateway to multitasking, and it causes all kinds of delay and problems. So actually thinking about, who do you need to keep close in order to get your work done? Who do you need to have quick response times from? Can actually be a very powerful question. Okay, so we talk about dialogue, and you'll notice we're having a dialogue with ourselves. We're asking ourselves powerful questions, and we're listening to the answers. Okay, and that's going to come back in a moment when we talk about how to scale that. Okay, now the next element is visualization. We use what we call a priorities map. You'll see this picture on the left: waiting, working, done, the basics of Kanban. Done is a really special state. I like done. It's easy to celebrate done. If something is in progress, it's kind of hard to celebrate it. It's much easier. You want to dissect it. You want to understand it. If it's done, you can pat yourself on the back, move it into the done column, put it in the archive, and forget about it, and you're happy. Okay, so we like done at the end of each iteration. So in personal agility, this actually originally started out as 3 separate maps, okay? One for the past, the breadcrumb trail, one for the present, the priorities map, and one for the future, the forces map. Oh, and you'll notice we have an additional column, the what really matters column, okay? And this is actually an information radiator reminding you about what you really care about, okay? What are you trying to achieve? Who do you want to be? That comes on the top card of the what really matters column. And then each of these cards represents a major theme or a major, how should I say, a major force or a major factor in your life that you want to pay attention to. And then what happens is we color code the individual tasks to match up with the corresponding element that really matters, okay? And this enables you to visualize: am I spending enough time on the things that matter? Am I spending too much on this and not enough on that, or maybe the other way around? Okay, so it gives you the possibility of navigating your life. And one of the things I really like, this is a product called Kanban Zone, and Kanban Zone actually lets us manage all 3 aspects on the same board. You can open the boards and close the boards and move the cards from left to right. And so I started using it about 3 months ago, and I've really taken a liking to it. So, dialogue. Dialogue is about asking questions. Okay, now everybody wants answers, but the answers you get are only as good as the questions that you ask. I think this is one of the major shortcomings, when we look particularly at Scrum. Scrum started out as a process to follow, but I like to think of it more as a series of opportunities to ask powerful questions. Okay, and the better the questions, the better the dialogue, the better the answers you get. Okay, so one of the key skills that we need is to be able to ask good questions if we want to be a good leader. Okay, so we take personal agility, and we see there are basically these 5 elements: purpose, navigation, cadence, visualization, and dialogue. And these 5 elements add up to self-leadership: the ability to achieve long-term goals, to recognize when you've gotten distracted, to process new information. Okay, and we started collecting case studies. We've documented many of them in the book. One of the things we noticed is that our case studies, they were usually accompanied by finances. That is, a successful case is also financially a successful case. I've talked to you about Walter. Walter's case was a turnaround. Michael Mochen was also a turnaround. How shall I say, a startup that was trying to avoid hitting the ground. Sharon went from struggling and barely holding her neck above water to having a thriving middle-class income. Corey went from a little bit better than struggling, but not much. In 2 iterations, increases income by a factor of 5. Ben, his company, he was the CEO of a medtech startup. They'd done all the Scrum trainings, but somehow it wasn't gelling. But with personal agility, with the empathy and trust that they were able to develop in the leadership team, that enabled them to accelerate their valuation. They hit their $35 million valuation in half the time that they thought it was going to take them. Okay, so there's, when we get this alignment between what we do and what we care about, amazing things happen, and they often get measured financially. Now, what's different about leading others? How is leading others different than leading yourself? And I think in terms of the goals, there's really no difference. We still want to achieve long-term goals. The only difference is there are other people involved. We need to do this collectively. Okay. And the second part of that is we need to respond to new information, to change effectively, again, together. Okay, and this is an area, particularly this last one, we notice, in large organizations, how difficult it is to make a decision, how difficult it is to get something started. This is an area where I think there is really huge potential for improvement. If we can kind of, introduce cadence into leadership, I think we're going to discover that our organizations can get much better at reacting to change. So how do these pieces fit together? Well, if we take a look at this company here that was good at getting something done, what happened before they did that? Okay, and so if we work back, we discover that they were able to take a decision. They were able to take a decision that they were really committed to, that they could hold their focus long enough to actually achieve the goal. Okay, what enabled them to do that? Okay, well, they had a common understanding of their purpose. Okay, they knew what they cared about, they knew what outcomes they were striving for, they knew what alternatives they'd have. They considered the alternatives, and they said, this is what we want to achieve together. And by getting the shared foundation, the shared understanding, that enabled them to take a decision to move forward. Well, where did that shared purpose come from? Okay, well, the relevant stakeholders, they were aligned on what really mattered. They were aligned, they had listened to each other about the problems, they considered the problems, they considered the alternatives, and they were able to come up with this common purpose, this consensus that they agreed on, and this allowed them to move forward. Okay, now, in my experience, that multilateral agreement, now, with these things, there are many different ways to achieve them, but what I often see happening before the multilateral agreement is a series of bilateral alignments, where there's one person who is brokering, negotiating, kind of offline, out, not on stage, not in the public eye, but making sure that we understand each other, that we know what really matters to the other person, that we might not agree on everything, but we agree on what the issues are. And even if we don't agree on what the solutions are, we agree that we need to find a solution. So we create this alignment first individually, and this allows us to create the alignment among a larger group of people. Okay, and that really comes down to empathy. Okay, now empathy is a word that gets tossed around a lot, and for some people it has kind of a woo-woo definition. For me, empathy is something that emerges out of dialogue, and it's really very simple. Step one, I listen to you. Step two, you listen to me. Okay, and this is my observation. If I have really listened to you, you are likely to be more willing to listen to me. Okay, and all I have to do is kind of deposit my ideas after I've listened to you, and you'll be willing to think about them. Okay, now we don't have to agree about with what the other person is saying. They might have a different position or a different approach, but we care about what the other person is saying enough to listen to it and make sure that we've really understood it before we start debating it. Okay, and that in turn, just getting that creates the necessary empathy, and that sets this whole process in motion. Okay, now alignment is a big problem. This has been known as a the most difficult thing to do in organizations. I first stumbled on the topic around 2012. I found an interesting article. I was looking, 2 days later, I went looking for that article again. I couldn't find it because, the forest was so thick because of all the trees. I couldn't find that article, but I found this one. This one is from Forbes in 2012. And what they say is most organizations, only about 2/3 of organizations have a strategy. Few employees understand the strategy. Even fewer companies succeed at executing on their strategies. Okay, so this alignment is relatively rare. And so what personal agility, it basically exists at two levels. Okay, that first level is leading yourself. Okay, based on, purpose, navigation, cadence, visualization, and dialogue, first with yourself. And then it springboards off of dialogue to work with other people to create empathy, multiple levels of alignment, a common shared purpose, and that enables both decisiveness, and if we bring back in cadence, it also enables responsiveness to new information. Okay, so this is the space of personal agility. What I'd like to do is take a breath and take a break and check out the chat. Do we have any questions at this point?
Sorry, Peter, just searching from unmute. No, nothing in the chat so far. So no questions coming up yet. So yeah.
Okay.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
Well, so what I'd like to do then is let's switch the share for a moment. And so with any luck, you're now looking at the Mentimeter from the poll we just took. Are we seeing that? Sath, can you give me? Yes. Okay, great. So, and we see we're a fairly diverse group. We're got a couple people from North America. Now, I did not vote on this, but it looks like I'm not the only person in Lithuania today. Okay, that's cool. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, and we have quite a mixed group of people here. So we have one person who considers themselves contributor level. Well, sorry, 4%, 12% senior contributor, 28% team managers, 36% multi-level team managers. And I put coaches and managers in at the same level. That's probably one person who considers themselves an executive, and probably about 3 or 4 who consider themselves to be something else. Now, this is something I have noticed about kind of agile meetups. They tend to be very heavy with coaches and managers. We tend not to see many people at the contributor or senior contributor level. And I haven't decided if that's a good thing or a bad thing or something that worries me. But one thing that Rita McGrath pointed out is that most transformation efforts do not consult with the people who will be, who will be impacted by the transformation. And this is usually a sign that the transformation is going to fail. Okay, so we need to get everybody on board, especially at the contributor level, the people actually doing the work. This is the value zone. Okay, this is 80% of the company is the value zone. And as we see in our agile meetups, this, by the way, is very, very typical for the meetups and events that I've been to. The contributor level is quite underrepresented. Okay. Wow. So how much time do you spend per week in meetings? Okay. Now this is at a 0 to 10 scale. Okay, and 10 would be 40 hours a week. So what we're saying here is that the average is 55% or 22 hours. That is actually the highest number I've ever seen since I started doing these polls. We're going to come back to this number a little bit later. Now, well, let's put it this way. It's the highest I've seen as an average group. Now, what sometimes, if we have a lot of agile coaches in the room, especially if they're working on more than one team or even 2 to 3 teams, that number can go up a bit. That might be okay. I tend to see executives tend to be around 60 to 70%. And then another 30% of their week doing emails. And they say, wait a minute, when do they do their actual work? Well, that's what nights and weekends are for. And so that's also why it's not uncommon for executives to work 50 to 60 hour work weeks, more like 60 than 50, okay? Because really too many meetings. And this, by the way, is that pitch I made, that pitch I showed you before. Hey, let's look at your meetings. Let's look at what's a valuable use of your time and what's not. And I guarantee you, if 70% of your week is meetings, we can find 10% of that, which is candidates for deletion. Okay. Scheduled meetings that are a good use of your time. Okay, so notice we've got 55% scheduled, 31% are a good use of your time. So that means that 20% of your time. Okay, so what is that? 8 hours a week, a full day, is meetings that are not a good use of your time. Okay. Yeah. Now, Scrum events should average about 12%, maybe 15% if you count backlog refinement. I think it's time boxed to 17% with, Yeah, might be 20% with backlog refinement figured in. So unless you're working with more than one team, these numbers are too high, okay? And they're a sign that you probably, um, you know, I'm not sure if it's your daily scrums that are going too long or your sprint plannings or well, usually it's sprint planning and daily scrum that people go over on. But if you're over 15% per week on the average and only working with one team, I would have a look at how you're doing scrum. Okay, so I'm not going to go too much into the reporting structure now, except to recognize it. I have a slide. I didn't do the slide because I didn't think I was going to have time for it. If we have time for it, I'll show it to you. But it's called the Management Mass Index, kind of like the Body Mass Index. And basically, what you do is you look at the size of your company, say how many levels of management would we need if we had one manager for every 5 direct reports all the way up. Okay, so if you have a company with 125 people, you would need 3 layers of management. 4 layers of management would take you to 625. 5 layers would take you to 3,000. So if you have 3,000 people in your company and you have more than 5 layers of management, that means your management is probably overweight. Okay. Okay, and so we see we've got a lot of discussion about how effective our work is, how well aligned we are. Notice, remember I said alignment was a big problem. Decisiveness is a big problem. Now, if you guys represented one company, I would say, okay, this is where we need to start on our agile transformation, okay? We got stakeholder alignment issues and we're not dealing with our impediments. Okay, and I'd probably, even though the alignment is worse, I'd probably start with the impediments because being able to deal with the impediments is the first impediment or one of the first impediments. Okay, and we see the lack of how should I say, our challenges internally also get reflected internally. Okay, and so here we see we're not very good at delivering product quickly. We're not very good at innovation. Imagine these were net promoter scores. They would be disastrous. Okay, so basically what we now have are some things that we can start to work on. We can use this to target our the work of our Scrum Masters and our Scrum of Scrum teams to say, okay, what do we need to get better at? Okay, so any questions come up in the meantime, or shall we go on to the next, go on to the multitasking?
Good to carry on. No questions yet.
Okay. Is anybody awake? Okay, give me, give me a thumbs up or something like that, just to signify that you're awake and that you're hearing that. Okay, Sath is here. That's good. I can only see Sath, so okay. Okay, so I got a couple people here. Excellent. That's making me feel much better. Okay, and somebody smiled. So that's my heart is warmed. Okay, so let's go on to multitasking. Okay, so you should be able to see my PowerPoint slides again. Is that correct? Okay. So here is the problem with multitasking. It's really quite simple. You're working on one task. 100% of your effort goes into that task. Okay. What happens if you're working on 2 tasks? Well, half of your effort goes to one, half of your effort goes to the other. Okay. And you see what happens as we split down all the way to 5 tasks. Okay. Now, what happens what happens to the time it takes to complete your tasks? Okay, so if I'm working on one task and I can do it in a week, if I'm working on 5 of those tasks in parallel, how long will it take me to get one of them done? Okay, and the answer is basically 5 weeks, okay, because you've got 1/5 of the time. So theoretically, it should take you 5 weeks. Does anybody believe that answer? Okay, fellow named Jerry Weinberg, who was a leading thinker in software development in the 90s and 2000s, he published a model which basically said, when you're multitasking, for every additional task that you take on, you give up 20% of your total capacity for task switching. Okay, he called them switching costs. Okay, and so we do the math and we see that that leads to a much worse protection. He says if you're working on 5 tasks at once, it's not going to take you 5 weeks to finish those tasks. It's going to take you 20. So how does that work? Okay, so if you are only working on one thing, you have no switching costs. Okay, you focus on it. You've got 40 hours of work to do, and you've got 40 hours to do it, and you just do it. And I'm actually giving a workshop for an organization here in Zurich, well, here in Zurich, my hometown in Zurich. And that's how they work now. They get a task, they can focus on it. They have hardly any meetings, they have hardly any discussion. They grind through it, very predictable. And it's done. Well, what happens when you what happens when you start multitasking? This is where switching costs come in. I may need to stop and get a drink. I'm going to hopefully this will pass. So when you say 20% of your capacity is eaten by switching costs, that leaves 80% of your capacity to do work. With 3 tasks in parallel, you've lost 20%, et cetera, et cetera. By the time you've got 5 tasks in parallel, 75% of your time is lost to switching costs, according to the model. Okay. Now, this model matches up fairly well with observations on things like cycle time and cycle efficiency. The problem is, no one has really been able to figure out why is switching so expensive. And in fact, sometimes switching is very expensive, and sometimes switching isn't expensive at all. Okay, there are 5 tasks trying to get work done and really not getting any time. And this is why things move to a crawl, is because you're obviously very busy, but you're not really spending any time on things that get done. Now, this takes me to Twitter. Now, as you know, Elon Musk purchased Twitter about 6 months ago. I think it was November of last year. And the first thing he did was he hired half of the staff. Sorry, he fired half of the staff. Why did he do that? Why did that make sense? Or why did he think that made sense? So let's just assume for a moment that your company has 100 people in it. Okay. Now, if we look closer at those 100 people, what we will discover is roughly one in 5 is some kind of manager, from team leader all the way up to CEO. If we had agile coaches and trainers, I would put them in that basket as well. They don't actually do the work of the company. They guide, they enable, they support, they hold the company together is basically what they do. So what that means is the other 80%, they do the work of the company. Okay. Unless, of course, they're in a meeting. Okay. Now, the results we got today were a little bit heavier than average. The first article I saw on it, which generally seems supported by the queries that I've done, suggests that we spend on average 45% of our time, that is 18 hours out of 40, in meetings, which means we've only got 55% of our time to do actual work. Okay, so if we kind of average that out over the whole company, if this really applies to all of our knowledge workers, okay, and one of the things I'm quite willing to admit is that my studies have been a bit heavily biased towards coaches and managers and trainers, and it might be a bit different if we talked about actual frontline employees. But it looks like at any given point, out of 80 people who are expected to be doing the work of the company, 36 of them are in a meeting. Okay, or if you prefer, 44 of them are doing the work of the company. Now we come back to Elon Musk, who in his first week at Twitter realized that the board members don't do any actual useful work. All they do is talk. And so he fired them. And then he looked a bit closer and came to similar realizations that they basically had a two-class system. There were people who did work, and there were people who talked about work. And he said, well, I don't have budget for people who don't do work. And the thing about meetings is you look at, it's a zero-sum game, okay? If you spend all of your time working and none of your time in meetings, or no, let me rephrase that. If you don't spend any time in meetings, you can spend 100% of your time working. But the more time you spend in meetings, assuming you're limited to that 100%, well, the less time you're going to have to do actual work. Now, when we say, okay, we take that calculation and say, okay, if I've only got 40% of my capacity, how long is it going to take me to get my work done? And you see that this becomes one of those classic hockey stick, the more time you spend in meetings, the less work you're getting done, and eventually you never get any work done at all. Okay. Now, I was thinking, how does that compare to Jerry Weinberg's model? Okay. Now, this doesn't seem, I haven't seen any evidence that lots of people are spending, 70% of their time, except for executives. I haven't seen evidence that people are spending 70% of their time in meetings. But when we're multitasking, how are we deciding what to do? Okay, so the prediction is that, by the time we have 5 tasks in parallel, it's going to take 20 times as long, 4 times longer than it should, just based on multitasking. But if we look at the impact of meetings on top of the impact of multitasking, well, how many meetings per week do we have to get these numbers? Okay, and I did the math, and I discovered at 8 hours per week, it's going to take us 2.5 times as long as we would expect. At 16 hours per week, that increases to 5 times as long. And at 30 hours a week, that takes us to 20 times as long. Okay, so I think what I've done, I think here I have found the switching costs. Okay, now I think this is a little bit steeper. I'm not quite sure, but there are other effects like 30 hours a week is entirely possible for managers. And if these managers are key stakeholders who have to make decisions, the wait states that causes could also impact the performance. But I think that most of the switching costs of multitasking are caused by the coordination meetings that are necessary when you've got all of these projects in flight together. So why did Musk fire everyone, or half the company? Why did he do that? So I think if we look at where Twitter probably was when he came in, a manager class, a talking class, and a group of people actually doing the work. What I think he wanted to do, and this is interpolation based on very indirect sources of information, so I could be wrong in any of this, but what I think he was trying to do was get rid of the people who just sat in meetings. I think what he got was something a little different. He did it too fast, and the divisions weren't quite as binary as he thought they were, or he was thinking they were. And so he fired some people he shouldn't have, he kept some people he shouldn't have, and most importantly, after these rounds, and especially after the second round and the third round, everyone was either angry or frightened or both. Okay, and the fact that he has been rather arbitrary in his hiring or especially his firing decisions of late has probably not been good for Twitter. Okay, so I think I do believe that there is a lot of potential out of all of these meetings to improve the performance and really move the needle on the performance. I'm really puzzled why Musk did it this way at Twitter, because all of his other companies, he's got a long-term vision and a high respect for engineers, and they're regarded as great places to work. But that didn't happen at Twitter, and I'm kind of at a loss as to explain why. Now, a related case, maybe you've heard about this because they've been in the news a bit. In fact, they just had another round of layoffs, I don't know, last 2 weeks. Let me take a step back for a moment. If we look at Scrum, how much time do you spend in meetings working in a Scrum team? And I said earlier, on average, about 12%, okay? Depending on your sprint length, the weeks might vary a little bit because some are more than others, but it's an average of about 12%. Seth, you got a question?
No, just a time check, really, just to let you know, we're about just 5 past the hour. So we've got about 20 minutes.
Okay, we're doing good. Okay,
Cool.
we're on final approach here. Okay, so as I say, so we're time boxed to 12% of our time for Scrum events. Okay, now this doesn't forbid us from holding other meetings, but on the other hand, you shouldn't have much need for other meetings in Scrum. Now, listen, I'm not trying to argue that we should do Scrum in the organizations. I'm just saying, let's take it as a thought exercise. What would happen if we got our level of meetings down to the level of what we would expect to see in a Scrum project? Okay. So, remember, one of these little people represents a person. And you see, these are the guys who were doing work before. And all of these green guys, this is capacity that would be freed up by going from 44% down to 12%. Okay. Or in other words, we're going from 44 people doing the work of the company to 66 people doing the work of the company. Okay, so basically what we're doing is we're increasing the capacity of the company, the effective, how much work is actually getting done. We would expect it to increase by about 50%. Okay, if this math is correct. Now, Shopify was kind of interesting because they introduced what they called a culture of focus. Okay, in layman's terms, they canceled all their meetings. Okay, canceled all their meetings. And then they were very intentional about how they allowed meetings after clearing all their calendars. Okay, so first of all, they declared 1 day a week to be meeting free. I think it was Wednesday. They said large meetings, okay, with more than a certain number of people, so like think of a big room event or an all company event, could only happen on Thursdays. Okay, so they put a constraint on how many meetings could really, totally sap the company's capacity. And in general, they said be intentional about meetings. Okay, make sure you've got a good reason for having the meeting. Make sure you invite only the people who really need to be there. Okay, and optional and things like that. And so a couple months later, there was an article. Again, one of those things I found on LinkedIn. I hope I can find it again. Oh, one other thing they did concurrently. Like every other tech company, they had a reduction in force. They laid off about 10% of their staff. Okay, so fast forward 6 months later, what are they doing? Well, one of the things they noticed is that they were actually getting more done. Okay, they were expecting to complete 25% more projects than what they had originally planned and budgeted for at the beginning of the year because they were actually faster. Okay, now notice this is even though they laid off 10% of the staff. Okay, so if we adjust for, the layoff, that basically means they increased their productivity by about 40%. Okay, so they didn't get the full 50% that I predicted in, with using Scrum as a reference, but it was real close. Okay, and I think that you can make a good argument. Well, if they'd held it for a year and really published the statistics, we would have been able to make a good argument that they validated, Musk's hypothesis and the math behind that. Having said all that, I do believe that there is a huge amount that you can do to improve the results, the effectiveness of your organization through this, really just through this focus culture. So what can you do? Well, I want to leave you with something that you can use as maybe a workshop in-house. This is the basis of my Optimize for Speed workshop. How do we get rid of the meetings? How do we get rid of the other kinds of friction? So 6 questions. Question number 1, what is our product or service? Understand what we're doing. So we talk about maybe a value chain, or we talk about a particular, as I say, a particular product or service that we offer. Get clear on what it is that we're doing and what we're not doing. Next question, what skills and authority are necessary to create it or produce it? Okay, and the result here is a list of skills that might be development skills, marketing skills, system integration, system management, whatever. But also, what is the decision-making authority? What approvals are necessary? That might be in-house, that might be legal compliance. Kind of what is the inventory of things that we need to have that we might be dependent on? Okay. Then we make a map. Where are these skills located? Okay, so you draw a complete picture of your organization, and here you want to highlight bottlenecks, dependencies, organizational boundaries, any place where friction can appear, any place where dependencies might arise that might be aggravated by conflicting priorities. Okay, now we look at the flow from the input to the output. You can draw this as a line, but you can also draw it as a line through your map to say, okay, how does value get from idea to done? Or raw data to, or raw materials to finished product, okay? And what you want to see is where you're actually working on it, where is it waiting, okay? And the technical term for what you're creating here is your value, your value stream, and you're also looking at the statistics that would give you cycle time and cycle efficiency. Okay, so what is the, where do things need to move, and where are they taking a long time? Okay. So now we can say, okay, who needs to collaborate more closely? How can we, and this is really looking at those handoffs. If we can replace a handoff with some direct communication, that can accelerate both speed and quality. And then finally, well, how would we like to organize it? So now we draw a new picture. Okay, and what that new picture should do is that should give you a much smoother flow from idea to done, with fewer interruptions, with fewer handoffs, with more direct collaboration. Okay, and if I were a betting man, I would say that any company that does this on a value chain can probably accelerate their time to market by at least a factor of 2. Okay, and possibly more. So maybe one last thought on at a personal level. If you wanted to get started with personal agility, how would you do that? Like to invite you to get the book. We've lowered the price of the book. It is now just $10 on Amazon. If you're here in the conference, I actually have physical copies. And the other thing is, I'm going to be starting I've got a cohort starting in May, I guess in 2 weeks, and another one starting in June. Where you can get going with the basics of personal agility. The idea is to learn the necessary skills for personal leadership. In particular, how to deal with procrastination, how to organize yourself, how to manage your time, how to deal with distractions. It's basically 2 sessions of about 3 or 4 hours each, and then 2 follow-up sessions with coaching. It leads to a recognized enthusiast badge, and we've got special pricing on it. I've actually kind of rethought the pricing on it to move it much lower. So if you'd like to get started, you can scan either of these links. These will give you the start dates, and we'll be off and running. So anyway, it's an opportunity, and I'd be delighted if you'd like to join me on these courses. I'm going to put these 2 links into the chat as soon as the presentation is over. The first is, if you want to continue the conversation with me in any other way, be delighted to connect with you on LinkedIn. And also, if you're curious about that Kanban zone and want to set up your priorities map with Kanban zone, I have a promotion code that you can get it for. You get 2 months for free by using the promotion code, and you get access to my template to create your priorities map. So, if you'd like that, I will put that in the chat for you. And with that, I am going to say thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for staying and listening to the whole event. And wow, God, I opened the I turned off the screen share and I see everyone's still here. That's amazing. So I'm going to say thank you very much. It's been an honor. And I will pass the talking stick back to Seth for questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. That was great. Lots of great stuff in there. And we'll get the recording out for those who missed the live session. We do have a couple of good questions. We've got maybe about 5 to 10 minutes or so. Check up on a few things. There was a nice one I saw that it'd be great to get your thoughts on. So earlier you were talking about multitasking and things, and you were talking a lot about meeting cultures and what they did at Twitter, and then what they did, what was the other place you mentioned? I've forgotten already. Where they completely cut the meeting. Spotify. Can't remember. And the question
Shopify. That's fine. I confuse it too. There's Shopify and there's Spotify. Okay.
Shopify.
Spotify is the music company. Shopify, they're kind of an online
Yeah.
online trading portal.
I worked with the latter, yes. So the question from Ben was, in a remote working environment, how do you differentiate between a meeting and just remote collaboration?
Oh, very good question. Very good question.
I thought so.
It's kind of like beauty and pornography. I know it when I see it. I'm not quite sure. Let's put it this way. Some things which I think are obviously good collaboration. Okay. If you and I get together, let's say you're the stakeholder. Okay. You understand the problem that needs to be solved. And I'm the developer. You know, I know how to implement the solution once I've understood what the problem is. Okay. You and I sit down and we have a conversation. Okay. That's problem solving. Okay. And I would put backlog refinement kind of in that pot as well. It's problem solving. And that I would generally put under the heading of good collaboration. If, let's say, you are the stakeholder and I'm a requirements engineer, and I'm going to have a conversation with you about what the problem is. And then I'm going to have a chat with Grant, who's the window on my right, and Grant is the business analyst, and I'm going to explain to him your requirements. Okay, that's a handoff. Okay, and then Grant is going to have go have a conversation with the development team to explain the feature that needs to be implemented. That's another handoff. Okay, and each of those handoffs is an opportunity to add noise and lose information and lose the big picture, and it slows down the process because there are delays between these handoffs. Okay, so in general, I would call things like that not good meetings. Okay, and I would try to minimize them. Okay, I would try to get the stakeholder talking directly with the people. You know, the people who understand the work and the people who do the work need to be in the conversation. And if you have a meeting where, you know, that involve people who, you know, who are just, if you're having conversations about what work should be done without the people doing the work in the room, it's a waste of time because you're going to have to do it at least twice. Okay, so you know, these are the kinds of tests that I would use to try to distinguish good meetings from bad meetings. Okay, now maybe one last thought about remote collaboration. You know, I do a lot of remote training, and I find that people can just barely survive 2 days in Zoom, and 3 days is definitely too much. So you know, I think you need to meter your you know, kind of remote work and especially the remote interaction, because it can be very demanding and very draining.
Fantastic. I've got a couple more to creep in. I'm just scrolling back. So we did have one earlier from Christina about multitasking. I think it's a two-pronged question. So multitasking does not mean that the time will be split equally all the time, right? That's the first part of our question. And then, my reactions popped up in front of it. Maybe combining a small, easy and valuable task to ease a very brain tiring task could help increase focus, therefore increase productivity. What are your thoughts?
It depends. So, you know, first of all, what I was trying to do with those graphs is not to give you the truth, but to give you a thought model to kind of help you think about it. Okay, so there's a lot of simplifications in all of those, you know, in all of those graphs, you know, to kind of make them easily understandable. Okay, you know, and what is the right amount of multitasking? First of all, I don't believe you could ever get to zero multitasking. One of the things I talk about, I make the comparison between multitasking and evil. Evil for me is like weeds in your garden. Okay, you're never going to get rid of all the weeds. Even if you think you've gotten rid of all the weeds, next week you're going to have weeds again. So as I say, it's an endless battle. Okay, you're never going to win it. But on the other hand, if you stop fighting it, the weeds will take over, and sooner or later, no tomatoes. Okay, so when you're, when we're thinking about multitasking, yeah, sometimes you need a rest. Okay, and I think one of the most important things for us as human beings to recognize is that it's okay to need rest, and it's okay to actually take rest. And sometimes the best time to take rest is in the middle of the afternoon, which is one of the advantages of home office as opposed to working in an office. Because if you're tired, when you're tired, something can seem impossible, and you take a 15-minute power nap, and all of a sudden, tack, and it's done. Okay, so I'm not trying to say that all task switching is bad. And I think it's this kind of forced task switching that you get when you've got a lot of stakeholders telling you what to do, and they're kind of continuously arguing about whose product or whose project is the most important. And so you kind of, spend 2/3 of the day deciding what to work on, and then you have to go to a meeting, so you drop what you're doing and lose your, that's very destructive. But on the other hand, if you say, man, I've been working on this problem for an hour, and I'm just beating my head against the wall. I need to get some fresh air. Or, I want to do something easier, or, something different, just to, that's entirely possible. And if it works for you, why not?
Great. One last one, I think, just to wrap this up. I think Sheila had an interesting, it's a question, yeah. So why assume meetings don't add value?
Well,
there. If you're discussing future direction and objectives, how will everyone who has been excluded from the meeting understand organizational goals?
Okay. Again, that's a really tricky question. How do you tell when it adds value? Let me ask you a different question. How do you do that today? Let me go. Let's go back to who asked the question. How do you decide today whether a meeting has value or not?
Sheila, still here? Welcome to.
I'm still here.
Yeah. So how do you deal with that problem today?
I invite everybody and tell the people whether if they're required, they need to come. If they have to.
Sheila, your audio is not great. We can't hear you. Really muffled.
I don't know why.
Really faint.
No,
Was that just me? I don't think it was just me.
Yeah, I couldn't understand her very well either.
Is it any better now? I'm trying to lean in.
Yes, that was the problem.
Okay, the first thing is when I schedule any kind of a meeting, I tell people I'm going to decide who needs to be there, who's required, and who's optional. The optional people are there for informational purposes. If they don't have time, they don't have to come. So I'm not forcing them to be there. But if it's something where we're going to talk about future direction, coordination, changes in direction or deliverables, then probably everybody should be there. But I also don't think if it takes 10 minutes to talk about that and we scheduled it for a half an hour, everybody gets 20 minutes back.
Okay.
So I don't know if that addresses what you're asking or not. Well,
let's put it this way. One thing which you can do is kind of at the end of the meeting, did you get value from it? Did it produce value for the organization? Okay. And remember, I think the problem with meetings is that there's kind of there's the micro optimization, kind of how well did we do the meeting, but there's also the global information. If you had 8 people in the room, the counter is running multiplied by 8, and that's costing time that you can only use once. And kind of, was it a good use of the time? And so one of the ways that you can tell that it was a good use of the time is, are people actually paying attention to what's going on in the meeting, or are most of them actually doing their emails? Okay, and if the people are feeling they're there because they need to be there, but actually mentally they're someplace else, that's probably a sign that the meeting was not well invested time. Now, why might you do this? So a colleague of mine was a kind of seniorish middle manager. I don't think he was, executive vice president level, but he was up there, and he was important enough that he had kind of representational functions. And there was a lot of infighting that goes along in the different departments of the bank that he worked at. And so basically the way he decided whether he would go to a meeting or not is he looked at who else was going to be at the meeting. And if he noticed that a lot of influential people were going to be at the meeting, he says, that meeting could be dangerous because these guys might decide, abruptly and unpredictably to make a decision. And if they're doing that, then I need to be there to, kind of represent my department and our department's needs. Okay. So his reason for going to the meeting was not that he cared about the content, but it was just defensive about politics. Okay. So, being able to tell whether the meeting is valuable or not and whether it's a good use of time or not is really tricky. And as I say, I think the test is, how many people are in there to do their emails and kind of keep their ears open in case something bad happens. And one of the things one of the things that I noticed about Scrum, which I thought was kind of interesting, Scrum defines, well, depending on how you count them, 4 or 5 events. And each one of them has got very specific, very well defined who needs to be there, what is the output of the meeting, what can be decided at the meeting, so that people know what to expect. Okay, and decisions about the direction of the product don't happen in the daily Scrum. Okay, kind of thing. Okay, and so I think that the predictability of the contents of the meeting, and I think this, I'm going to take this to a conference. I'm at a conference tomorrow. We've got an open space. I may even take this as a question to the open space. Can we define classic meeting patterns or classic meeting functions where we say, oh, we need to have a product planning meeting and that means this, or we need to have a, well, I mean, in Scrum we do this. We say we've got a sprint planning and it means that, and we've got a retrospective and it means something else. And, we don't go to expecting a retrospective and get a sprint review. Okay, and I'm wondering if we could generalize that concept to other kinds of meetings that happen in an organization. Okay, so that might also be, kind of a helpful way to increase the value of your meetings and make sure that only the right people need to come.
Yeah, I just had an objection to having all the meetings, saying all meetings are unnecessary, which was kind of the way what you said initially came across. Because there is a point where they are unnecessary, but if somebody does a poor job of planning and just rambles, that's bad on their part. But if you've got an organized meeting with a clear agenda and you've planned what you want to cover and socialized it ahead of time, meetings can be a good way to get to disseminate information or reach a conclusion.
Okay, you're fading out again, Sheila. And if I gave the impression that all meetings are bad, no, I did not mean to give that impression at all. Meetings are where interactions take place, and interactions is produces information. Okay, and one thing which I have noticed though is if I talk about meetings, people get defensive about their meetings very quickly. And so I think discussing meetings and the value of meetings, I think this pushes people out of their comfort zone. And so I'm kind of thinking there's an elephant in the room somewhere, but I haven't figured out what it is yet.
Well, I know in one organization where I worked recently, I was able to.
Okay, you got to speak into the microphone.
You've gone really faint. I don't want to cut you off, but in the interest of time, because we're kind of up on time. And to be honest, this is a great debate and one I think that, rages on everywhere, I think we all have this debate around meetings and the value of meetings. And how many meetings we're having? Most of us are in organizations which have meeting heavy cultures. I certainly am. So I think it's a great debate. I think you made a lot of good points here, Peter, but just because we're coming up on time, I'm going to bring it to a close there. Thank you for admirably answering all the questions that came up, and thank you, Sheila, for that provocative question right at the end there. We could always rely upon you to do that. That was brilliant. So yeah, just to say really, thanks for everything tonight, Peter. Great hosting you as always. I really enjoyed your insights. Thanks for all the stuff that you shared with the community. We'll make sure everybody gets that made available to them, and we'll share the recording for those who couldn't be with us this evening. But yeah, really enjoyed it, and thank you again for being our guest this evening. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. And just for everyone else, just the usual quick shouts. I put a couple of links in the chat. So they're just upcoming conferences that are kind of UK based, so they might be of value to those who are here locally. I think the interesting one is probably Scotland Hub in July, which is going to be hosted in Edinburgh. And it's an experiment as part of Agile 2023. So Agile 2023 is going to be in Orlando this year, but we are experimenting with Scotland Hub, which came out of some of the sort of post-conference considerations last year to think, how can we take these large global conferences and help perhaps reduce their carbon footprint? So it's a great, unique experiment. So if you are, and I thought it makes sense to plug it here in the Future Work Scotland. If you are in and around the Central Belt or Scotland anywhere, that might be a great, unique opportunity to take advantage of. Not least because Lisa Atkins is actually going to be here and she's doing the keynote. Myself and a few others are also hosting a workshop with Lisa, which we'll promote in the upcoming sessions as well. So just worth calling that out. And also just the usual, we've got a healthy pipeline of events coming for you over the next few months. We've actually got 2 for you this month. So it's a bumper May. We've got our old friend Erin Randall joining us at the end of the month. She spoke here a number of times. So she's doing a nice session on coaching supervision, which will probably be a nice session to follow on from the one that we had with Bob Gallen last month. And then in June, we've got our friend Chris Stone coming to talk about continuous improvement at scale, something he's very passionate, I know about. So yeah, a couple of things there to look out for. A few other things coming up. I think there's a hand up. Christina, have you got a question? Because I'm just wrapping up the session. Was that a mistake? Yeah. Oh, you've unmuted. Did you want to say something? No, maybe not. Maybe that was a mistake. So I think, yeah, that's us up on time. We have overrun a little bit. We do like to stick to our time box. So just to thank everyone for joining us. Thanks again to Peter for the session. Look out for the future sessions. And we hope we'll see you again soon. And look after yourself, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you happen to be. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.